Cutting off financial support was the final straw. It seemed they thought they could say this because I managed to keep things together working multiple jobs, raising 4 children on my own. Then my sister Sarah joined in with my mother.
This is what happens when you're uneducated. Don't ever set foot across this threshold again.
They both laughed, casting glances my way. When I looked back, I saw my daughters on the verge of tears. I couldn't take it anymore. Fine, but you'll regret it. They both exchanged surprised glances for just a moment.
Huh?
Then they both smirked, with that dismissive look they always gave me. Do whatever you want. Whether you're here or not, it doesn't matter to us all. Oh, and by the way, I'm actually remarrying someone quite wealthy. When I heard that, I was almost relieved. I took my daughters back into the house and immediately began to instruct them. We'll be leaving a little earlier than planned. You've all done well to hold on for the past 6 months. Let's go load up everything we packed into my car. Sure enough, the next day, Sarah's calls came in, one after another. But I ignored them, not feeling any obligation to respond. Judging by the constant calls and frantic messages, they were clearly panicked. Inwardly, I couldn't help but think, I knew it. My name is Alice Whitman. I just turned 30. I'm currently working multiple part-time jobs to make ends meet. In fact, I'm a single mother. I met my ex-husband when I was 20, at the company where we both worked, starting as colleagues and then dating. We got married the following year, and I was blessed with 4 children. My eldest daughter is 8, followed by my 7-year-old, a 3-year-old son, and my youngest son, who just turned 1. The reason for our divorce was my ex-husband's affair during my pregnancy with our 4th child. One day I got home early from work and found my eldest daughters sitting outside the house looking upset. My 3-year-old son, who was in preschool, was with me when I arrived, but seeing my daughters sitting outside instead of inside the house was shocking. I quickly realized why. I couldn't believe it. How could he bring another woman to our home at the time our children were returning from school? He had invited his young lover into our home and told my daughters to go play outside. It turns out they had been playing at a nearby park, seemingly having a good time. But it was winter, and the school had instructed students to return home by 5 p.m. When they came back, she was still there, leaving them feeling awkward, so they waited by the entrance. I couldn't stand the idea that he'd thrown out our kids to fulfill his own desires. Furious, I demanded a divorce immediately. He signed the divorce papers without a fuss, but refused to pay any alimony or child support, running off with her. The house was his inheritance, so I had no choice but to leave with the kids and move into an apartment. After that, stress began taking a toll on my health, and I eventually lost my job. I had initially quit my old job when we got married, and he left his too, likely to avoid being found. Both he and that woman cut off all contact, leaving me devastated and angry. Yet I still had to support my children, so I started working part-time jobs. During the day, I worked as a cashier at a supermarket and stocked shelves at a drugstore to make ends meet, but it still wasn't enough. I occasionally worked at a friend's bar at night, earning a little more money. While I worked at night, a friend's sister helped babysit my children, and I paid her what I could. Then, after a year of hard days, I finally gave birth to my 4th child, my youngest son. I somehow survived the whirlwind days that followed. One day, I received a call from an unknown number. I ignored it, thinking it was a spam call or a telemarketer, but the number kept appearing. Curious, I looked it up online, but it wasn't listed under any spam or telemarketing databases. Assuming it was a wrong number, I continued to ignore it, until one day I was at my usual shift at the supermarket, and I ran into Sarah for the first time in years. My face tensed up, but I kept a smile as I greeted her. Hey, how did you know I was working here? And where did you get my phone number? Sarah smirked, looking pleased with herself.
I have money, so I hired a detective. But I didn't want to spend too much, so I just asked them to get your number. I called you so many times, but you didn't pick up, so I paid extra to have them track down where you work.
I was stunned. Sarah, who had never cared about me, suddenly wanted to find me. I tried to ignore the unsettling look in her eyes.
Call me after your shift.
I didn't want to get involved, but since she went to such lengths to find me, I worried she might drag my children into it. Reluctantly, I called her number after work.
I want to meet up and talk. Let's meet at the diner nearby. You're free anyway, right?
She didn't even know that I was divorced or had kids. Sorry, I need to pick up my 2 youngest sons from daycare, and my 2 oldest are already home from school. There was a pause, then she burst into laughter.
You? Married with kids? Who would want to marry someone like you? Just leave the kids with your husband. Or wait, Do you even have one?
She snickered, and I could feel her mocking contempt over the phone. My cheeks burned with anger and humiliation. I had worked hard to move on from my ex, but she was reopening old wounds. It's none of your business. I have nothing to say to you. Don't contact me again. I hung up and immediately blocked her number. It all happened in just seconds, but I felt utterly drained, my shoulders heaving with exhaustion. I thought I was finally free from the chains of my past. Remembering the painful childhood I had shared with her and my mother, my stomach churned with nausea. I shook my head, pushing the thoughts away as I hurried to pick up my kids. That night passed peacefully with my children, without seeing Sarah. But Sarah wasn't one to give up easily.
What's taking so long? Hurry up already.
About a month after our argument, I noticed movers next door and wondered if I had new neighbors. To my horror, I saw Sarah and my mother stepping out of the moving truck. I hadn't spoken to my mother in years. She looked at me with the same disdainful eyes I remembered.
Let me guess. You got kicked out with your kids after your husband cheated on you? Honestly, look at you. An ugly duckling will always be an ugly duckling. Your kids are no different from you. Never swans. Always just filthy little ducks.
My heart pounded faster as I felt a familiar icy chill run down my spine. But I kept my composure and asked why they had moved next door. It turned out that my mother had hired a detective to locate my address.
You ignored our calls and blocked us, so we had to take drastic measures. Mom's health isn't great. She needs a lot of help now. We're sisters after all. It's our responsibility to support her together.
I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Why should I, after everything, have to take care of the mother who never cared for me? I felt a wave of anger that made my hands tremble. When have either of you ever done anything for me? They looked at me as if I were some ungrateful servant. They acted like family now, expecting me to help after treating me like a burden for so long. When I voiced my frustration, Sarah grabbed my arm and glared at me.
It's your duty. Children are supposed to care for their aging parents. Don't you understand that?
I yanked my arm free and stormed inside, locking the door behind me. They pounded on the door, but I ignored them. My sons looked at me, one anxiously, the other with an innocent smile. I hugged them tightly, promising myself that I would protect them no matter what. After a while, they gave up and went back to their moving tasks. Taking the opportunity, I quickly loaded the kids in the car and drove to daycare. At work, as I changed into my uniform, a colleague, a dear friend from high school, noticed my distress. She was one of the few who knew how badly my family had treated me. I couldn't help but vent my frustration. My mom and sister tracked me down and moved next door, saying I need to take care of my mom. She was outraged.
Ignore them. They've treated you horribly for so long. They don't deserve anything from you.
Her anger on my behalf gave me a small sense of relief. Back in high school, I had worked multiple jobs just to cover my tuition and barely managed to graduate. I had wanted to go to college, but my mother interfered, and it became impossible. My friend from high school had gone on to college and married into a stable, supportive family. Though we had been separated for a time, she was now my closest friend and a fellow working mom. She had once been a stay-at-home mom, but eventually returned to work part-time for her own fulfillment. Sharing my frustrations with her gave me a brief respite from the overwhelming stress, but that relief didn't last long. When I got home, my mother and sister were waiting outside my door fuming.
You should be helping with my care, you know.
Exactly. My joints have been aching and I can barely work. You need to start driving me everywhere.
I frowned. My mother looked perfectly healthy, so it was obvious she just wanted to make her life easier. Frustrated, I pushed past them and went inside, locking the door. They continued yelling outside, but eventually someone must have called the police, and they were told to leave. The officer, sympathetic to my situation, warned them to stop harassing me. But things didn't end there. Shortly after, my brother-in-law, who had been living with Sarah's family, returned as well. He and Sarah joined forces, belittling me for my lack of a college degree and treating me like an outcast. Moving wasn't an option because of financial restraints, and they constantly ridiculed me as a family disgrace. Sarah's husband even sided with her, laughing at me every chance he got. If I ever spoke up, he'd shout at me to stay in my place. I felt powerless and cornered. My mother, despite being in good health, demanded I drive her to her part-time job twice a week. She even insisted I take her to her regular doctor's appointments, and I was forced to cover all her medical expenses. Even when I fell sick, I couldn't afford to see a doctor, while she received the best care on my dime. One day she slipped and broke her leg, and it turned out she needed surgery.
You should pay for it. After all, I took care of you when you were little.
Her logic was absurd. She only took me to the doctor a handful of times, and she hardly spent anything on me growing up. You're being ridiculous. She looked at me, her face twisting in anger.
How dare you say that? Do you have any idea what I went through raising you?
I felt despair wash over me. While my mother was always comfortable financially, she denied me basic support. Sarah, on the other hand, got the best of everything: a private education, music lessons, and tutoring. My mother rarely even attended events or activities I was involved in. For school activities, she only ever showed up for Sarah. Even for my high school graduation, I had to cover my tuition on my own, barely managing to make it. I had dreamed of going to college, but my mother refused to support me financially. My high school counselor eventually persuaded her to let me attend high school, at the very least. I worked after school to pay my way, trying to keep up with my studies in a demanding environment. Despite the hardship, I graduated with good grades, but my mother never allowed me to pursue higher education. Eventually, I left home and started working, glad to finally be free from her oppressive grip. I could finally buy my own clothes and didn't have to wear Sarah's hand-me-downs anymore. While I built my life, Sarah thrived in the comfort provided by our mother's favoritism. Despite everything, I managed to find peace after leaving home. And compared to the hardships I'd faced, my ex-husband's betrayal seemed almost trivial. Of course, it would have been nice if he had paid child support, but I didn't expect anything. Why, after all of this, should I now have to take care of my mother? One day, while waiting in line to pay for my mother's medical bills, I remembered all the pain she'd caused me. I turned around and left, ignoring her calls as I drove off.
Wait! Come back here!
She hobbled after me with her crutches, yelling as I sped away. She could easily call a cab. With Sarah's dual jobs and my mother's part-time income, they had enough. I felt a small thrill of satisfaction as I drove away, finally asserting myself, but my actions only fueled their anger further. When I got home, I saw Sarah scolding my daughters, accusing me of abandoning our mother.
Your mom is a terrible person. She left your grandma at the hospital without paying a cent.
I rushed outside and shielded my kids from her wrath. This isn't their concern, and Mom makes enough to pay for her own expenses. I've reached my limit. Leave us alone. My mother stepped out and began shouting insults, her voice echoing through the apartment complex.
You're an embarrassment. You're not my daughter. I don't need someone as heartless as you in my life. This is it. We're done.
She declared us disowned, as if it were some victory for her. I couldn't help but feel a strange relief as I stared at her smug face. Sarah joined in, sneering as they laughed together.
See? Low education, low class. Never cross this threshold again.
I glanced back at my daughters, who looked on the verge of tears. Fine, if that's what you want, but you're going to regret this. They exchanged a surprised glance before breaking into smug smiles.
Go ahead. Do what you want. We don't need you around.
Oh, and just so you know, I'm getting remarried to someone wealthy, so we don't need you at all.
Surprisingly, this news brought me a sense of relief. I took my daughters back inside and quietly instructed them. We're leaving tonight. You've all been so strong for the last 6 months. Go pack your things and load them into the car. To avoid suspicion, I decided to wait until Sarah left for her night shift and my brother-in-law was distracted. Once they were gone, we packed as much as we could into the car and slipped away under the cover of night. As expected, the next morning my phone lit up with a flood of missed calls and messages from Sarah, but I ignored every call. The relentless messages showed just how panicked they were. I thought deep down they had always needed me more than they'd ever admit. I had planned this move for months, waiting for the perfect opportunity to escape. Financial constraints and the fully occupied apartments in the area had delayed my plans, but now it was time. I had saved every penny I could, waiting for an opening, and recently an apartment in a different district became available. I quickly secured it, knowing this would be our sanctuary. My daughters would be able to start fresh, away from my family's toxicity. We arrived at our new home exhausted, but at peace for the first time in years. A week later, I called Sarah, who answered immediately, her voice sharp with irritation.
Finally! Where have you been? I hope you're ready to explain everything.
Sure, I'll explain, but don't expect any help from me. I cut her off before she could argue, hung up, and immediately blocked her number again. I didn't need to explain myself, but I wanted to prevent any more harassment. Just in case she tried hiring another detective, I knew she didn't have much money left. As life slowly began to settle, one weekend I left the kids with friends and decided to meet with my family once more to settle things. I waited at a local diner. When they arrived, they looked eager for confrontation.
The police came to your old apartment. You didn't tell them where you went, did you?
Calm down. Here, have some tea. But that only fueled her anger, while my mother suddenly adopted a soft tone.
Look, sweetheart, I didn't mean all those things I said. You're my daughter, we're family, but things are tight. Would you mind loaning us a little money?
The hypocrisy was breathtaking. After all their disdain, now they were suddenly interested because they needed cash. I had filed a police report myself about Sarah's suspicious behavior at work. Why wouldn't the police get involved? You've been stealing. Sarah fell silent. I'd always wondered why she suddenly took on night work, despite her husband's job supposedly paying well. Then an astonishing revelation came to light. Sarah had been fired for embezzlement. She had hidden this from her husband, who thought her job was her main source of income. I realized that their sudden interest in finding me was to avoid responsibility, to make me care for our mother. They had no intention of shouldering any burden themselves. Sarah had concocted a plan to have our mother babysit her kids, while she claimed she worked extra hours for our mother's medical expenses. Instead, she intended for me to take on all the caregiving and financial responsibilities. My niece secretly confirmed this one day, mentioning how her mother often came home late and drained. Concerned, she had confided in one of my daughters, who then told me. Additionally, Sarah had been stealing from clients at her night job. I had already informed the police of her actions. When I moved, I asked them to hold off on any investigations until my children and I were settled in our new home. Today, Sarah's kids were safe and cared for, while Sarah faced her own consequences. My mother was equally guilty, having turned a blind eye to Sarah's actions and covered for her. But they saw me as the villain, accusing me of turning my back on them. Sarah has stolen not only from clients, but also from our community, pawning off association property for profit. My niece had witnessed her mother's unethical behavior too, and confided this in my daughter. Together with community complaints, the police eventually acted on the matter. When I asked my family about it, they finally admitted to the charges, their expressions filled with shame. In that moment, I knew the consequences would eventually catch up with them. With the police watching their every move, they faced not only possible arrests, but public disgrace as well. I left the diner feeling lighter than ever, knowing I had taken the first step toward peace for me and my children. After leaving the diner, I felt a sense of finality, as though I'd never closed a chapter I'd never wanted to read. I returned home where my children were playing, blissfully unaware of the family drama that had finally come to an end. For the first time in years, I could breathe freely. My father had offered his full support. He'd assured me he'd cover any costs from the civil lawsuit, wanting justice for me and his grandchildren. It was his way of making up for all the time we had lost, and I was grateful beyond words. I watched as my children ran around the yard, laughing, free of worry. As I took in their happiness, I silently vowed that I would never let anyone harm them again. A few weeks later, the results of my actions began to ripple through my old family. Sarah faced civil charges, and her theft had come to light in her community. Her reputation was destroyed. The family members who once scorned me began to distance themselves from her, realizing her manipulation. My mother, who had once felt invincible with her control, now found herself alone. Overwhelmed with debt, she was forced to downsize her life without the luxury she once took for granted. Meanwhile, I continued my new job where I felt valued and respected. Slowly, I built a peaceful life, one day at a time, a life I never thought I'd have. Each morning I sent my children off to school with a smile, knowing they were safe and free to pursue their dreams. I was finally the mother I wanted to be, and they were growing up in a home filled with love and stability. My father and I remained close. We met regularly, and he became a fixture in my children's lives. The kids adored their grandfather, who always had stories and wisdom to share with them. As my family healed, I could see that each day brought us further from the pain and closer to genuine happiness. My life had been difficult, but I'd risen from it stronger and more resilient. I'd overcome the darkness of my past, and now I could look forward to a bright future. Watching my children's joyful faces, I knew that all the struggles had been worth it. We were free. And in the end, that was the greatest gift I could ever give them.